This summer, Harry and Meghan's marriage has generated more photographs than the public has seen from many working royals through their official engagements. But the real question is simply how many pictures were released. It's what those photographs actually reveal.
The public relations dumpster fire, the emotional hot mess that is Harry and Meghan's marriage. This is beyond meltdown.
Meghan wants the limelight, Harry does not. And that the possibility could happen, but not with Meghan.
Embarrassing, therefore, that Meghan was completely blanked by David Foster when she reached out her hand at the photo call. This phony house of cards that is the Sussexes' marriage. Be afraid, be very...
5 people, 4 different programs, and ultimately one conclusion. Here's what this video is going to give you that the headlines never did. We are going to examine one evening in California when Harry and Meghan's marriage was photographed, presented, managed, and then seemingly met with a refusal, all inside the same room, all captured on professional cameras in roughly 90 seconds. Then comes the ledger that helps explain the bigger picture. Every solo appearance, every contradiction caught on camera, and one overlooked detail from that gala that virtually nobody covering the story has connected yet. That detail comes into focus about halfway through. There are 4 questions people search about this couple over and over again. Are Harry and Meghan still together? Why are Harry and Meghan so often photographed separately? Did David Foster snub Meghan Markle? And why does Prince Harry continue returning to Britain without his wife? We will address all 4 questions in that order with the footage alongside them. Stay with the story until the end because you will know exactly whose hand was left hanging, who left it there, and why the timing may matter far more than the moment itself. But first, we need to begin exactly where the Sussex media machine appeared to want the public to begin, with the photographs. Just days before the gala, a gallery appeared on Instagram. It presented a summer holiday, a curated glimpse of a family supposedly relaxed and comfortable, released through the same operation that has spent years arguing that the public does not truly understand them. Pay attention to the sequence, because many programs discussing this story presented the events without focusing on the order in which they happened. The photographs came first, then came the gala. The Duchess of Sussex had just released what was presented as evidence of a happy marriage before entering a room where that same marriage would be observed under professional cameras. And there's another obvious question about that gallery that almost nobody seems to have asked. Who was holding the camera? We are talking about a supposedly private family summer, photographed in private locations, yet someone appears to be standing at precisely the right distance, using precisely the right lens at precisely the right moment. True candid photography doesn't happen without a photographer, and these images clearly involved one. Each frame in that reel was captured by someone who had been permitted to be there, composed with deliberate framing, and ultimately released according to a schedule that would have been known to the people managing the public presentation. That doesn't necessarily make it fake, but it does make it something more deliberate than an ordinary holiday album. It looks like a campaign. Now look at the couple within those photographs. There was the photo drop, and within that collection was an image of Harry and Meghan appearing completely, almost blissfully happy together, performatively happy. That word carries a lot of weight here, and it is important to understand why. A performance needs 3 things: an audience, a script, and a reason to persuade someone of something they did not already believe. Contentment does require any of them. Real contentment does need a release schedule. There's an old idea that has been repeatedly applied to the Sussexes for a reason. It comes from the observation that someone who is completely content has little need to constantly announce that contentment to the world. With Harry and Meghan, we have seen almost the opposite. Not less, not quieter, but louder with every passing year. And that increase has happened at roughly the same time as there appears to be less and less private life left for the public to see. Run the timeline for yourself. The farther the Duke and Duchess of Sussex moved away from the institution that originally made them internationally fascinating, the more public-facing material seemed to arrive. Documentaries, a memoir, a podcast, a lifestyle brand, a cooking show appearance, an Instagram account relaunched and then regularly updated. The sheer volume becomes part of the story. Because when a couple's private life is genuinely functioning away from public attention, they don't necessarily need to keep releasing periodic proof of that private life.
So we had that photo drop, and in that photo was a photograph of Harry and Meghan looking blissfully, performatively
Inseparable. Read that word one more time, because the next 90 seconds are going to put it under a microscope using nothing but attendance records. This brings us to the first question people repeatedly type into search engines, and it deserves a direct answer, not another rumor or another carefully worded statement. Why are Harry and Meghan so often photographed separately? The test is actually very simple. If two people are truly inseparable, you would expect to see them attending things together. That is the whole test, not statements, not captions, not carefully presented images, not claims about how close they are behind closed doors. Look at where they actually show up. So here is the attendance record.
Created the stream of consciousness literature style. And she said a perfectly happy human being would be silent. We've had the opposite from Harry and
2.5 hours each way. That means roughly 5 hours of driving from a home in Montecito only to sit down for dinner without his wife. That doesn't look like an ordinary scheduling conflict. Scheduling conflicts happen on a Tuesday. Spending 5 hours in the car is a decision made ahead of time. It means a man was willing to give up most of a working day traveling there and back because he wanted to be somewhere his wife was not. That suggests a preference. And the sushi outing is actually the smallest item on the list.
endless propaganda about how in love they are, how attracted they are to each other, how bonded they are, how mutually inseparable they are.
New York, China, California, Britain, 4 different locations across the world, with Harry and Meghan appearing separately, despite being a couple whose entire commercial identity has been built around the idea of them as a pair. And it's important to understand what that could mean from a financial and commercial perspective, because this is the part that lifestyle coverage rarely says out loud. The original appeal was never simply Prince Harry by himself or Meghan Markle by herself. The product was the combination, the Duke and the American actress. The fairy tale, the image of the two of them entering a room together. But separating the pair doesn't necessarily destroy the commercial value. It simply changes how that value is presented. So a solo appearance isn't necessarily just a random diary detail. It can also represent the product being marketed without the partnership that originally made the product so recognizable. And then there was the polo outing, where Harry was seen watching someone else's children play while he was there alone. Think about that image for a moment, because it may be one of the quietest and most striking moments in this entire story. And this observation did come from a friend trying to defend Harry. It came from a commentator who had no particular sympathy for him. It was someone making excuses. It was someone describing what they believed they were seeing. And whenever a record like this becomes difficult to explain, the response from the Sussex publicity machine seems to follow a familiar pattern. More content, more evidence, more photographs, more carefully presented moments designed to demonstrate the very thing the existing photographs keep failing to establish convincingly. But now the presentation itself begins to look harder to maintain. The couple can release as many videos as they want showing affection toward one another. They can provide more images and more carefully selected moments. But if the public presentation is beginning to crack, then the harder the machine works to keep the image intact, the easier those cracks can become to notice. And that brings us to a cookery show in Australia, and another detail that is much harder to simply explain away: a guest appearance on MasterChef Australia. Food, childhood memories, fresh produce. It sounds like perfect territory for a lifestyle brand that needs to build a story around authenticity. Listen closely to the story being presented. She spoke about growing up loving fresh produce, good vegetables, quality meats, and locally sourced food. Locally sourced ingredients, fresh produce, great meats. A childhood supposedly centered around good food and quality ingredients presented to an Australian audience while promoting a food-related brand. Now compare that version with what the Duchess of Sussex had already said publicly on her own program about that very same childhood. So which version is it, Meghan? Because this is where the larger issue comes into focus. As one commentator put it, that is part of the duality surrounding the Duchess. A version of reality, a version of truth, and then another version presented as Meghan. 2 different accounts of childhood, the same woman, the same period of her life, but presented to different audiences for 2 very different commercial purposes. And that is the pattern worth paying attention to. It's really about food. It's about the way a personal history can be presented differently depending on the audience and the opportunity. Whichever version works best for the moment becomes the version that gets told. The past becomes inventory, and that inventory can be repackaged depending on who is buying. Once you accept the possibility that a childhood story can be reshaped to fit a particular booking, it becomes much easier to question whether the same principle could apply to the way a marriage is publicly described. So when the same operation tells you that the marriage is strong, stop and ask the one question that actually matters. Which audience was that statement designed for?
Well, good luck with that, because not only have we had months and months and months of Harry and Meghan going solo, including Harry at one point driving for 2.5 hours from his Montecito apartment to LA for a trip to Nobu, which is a sushi restaurant, right? Something fishy is going on.
Her version of the truth is starting to collide with reality. Keep that hall of mirrors in mind, because everything we've examined so far has come directly from the Sussexes themselves. Their photographs, their appearances, their captions, their statements, their own carefully presented moments. It's a closed loop, one that keeps validating itself. But now we're about to see what happens when that mirror is held up by someone who is part of the Sussex operation, is on the payroll, and was never asked to participate in creating the image. Enter the David Foster Foundation's 40th anniversary gala, a black tie event in California. This is one of the few rooms remaining where the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are still described publicly as long-standing friends of the host, not clients, not simply guests attending because of a sponsor. Friends, and that word matters. It matters because it changes the significance of everything that happens next. Before we get to that moment, though, we need to understand why Harry and Meghan were in that room in the first place.
Any solo appearances, not just Harry's trip to the sushi bar on his own to meet his friends, no Meghan, and Harry turning up at this Time magazine athletics event all by himself in California. He was in New York on his own, in China on his own, in Ukraine on his own, previously in the UK on his own, going to the polo barefoot, watching someone else's kids play on his own.
Nothing else to do. Read that sentence again, because it is really a statement about one particular event. It's a statement about a diary, and a diary can reveal more about a public figure than almost anything they choose to say publicly. This is a couple who once had a full working royal schedule, an international charitable platform, a foundation carrying their name, and a major streaming agreement that made them one of the highest paid non-acting signings in television. Now, every one of those things has either ended, been reduced, or moved into someone else's hands. What remains is an appearance at a friend's anniversary celebration, and that celebration has now become a recurring fixture. Then came the photo call.
But it gets worse, because now the mask is slipping. The couple can publish as many videos demonstrating how affectionate they are with each other.
Stop the footage right there. She extended her hand. Not toward a journalist, not toward a critic, not toward a member of the royal family who has supposedly spent years avoiding being in the same room with her. She reached toward the man whose 40th anniversary celebration she had come to attend. The friend, the host, the person whose event she was there to celebrate, and the person whose connection to the couple was part of the reason the invitation existed in the first place. At his own gala, in front of the cameras covering his own event, the Duchess of Sussex extended her hand, and nothing came back. Say that again, slowly. Her hand remained extended. And this is why that single moment deserves more attention than every rumor surrounding this couple. A rejection from an enemy is expected content. A stranger ignoring you means very little. But an apparent snub from a friend at that friend's own celebration with photographers standing nearby is something different. Because the host is the one person in that room who had every reason to make the photograph work. He had every reason to greet her warmly, every reason to complete the picture. And yet, in that moment, the picture did not happen. So the second major search question gets its answer right here. Did David Foster snub Meghan Markle? According to the footage from the photo call, Meghan extended her hand and it was not taken. Now, there is another possible explanation. It could have been an accident. Perhaps the timing was missed. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding in the receiving line. Perhaps the camera angle makes the interaction look different from what actually happened. That explanation is possible. But to accept it, you have to ignore what happened just seconds later during the same photo call.
She goes on there and she, by the way, talks about how when she was growing up, she loved fresh produce and it was all about good vegetables and great meat and locally sourced food.
And there it is, the detail that almost nobody covering this gala has connected. The behavior on that red carpet, directing adults, positioning people, arranging bodies, and controlling exactly who stands where for the photograph is new. It is the same kind of behavior previously directed toward Dr. Sophie Chandula. And Dr. Sophie Chandula was not simply another guest at a party. She is the chairwoman who now runs the charity Prince Harry founded in his mother's name, a charity he no longer controls. Follow the sequence carefully because the sequence itself is where the story becomes interesting. The last time the Duchess of Sussex was in a room directing that particular woman on where to stand for a photograph, the charity eventually came under Chandula's control, while Prince Harry ended up outside the organization he had founded. The staging did produce the intended result. It produced the opposite, and that is the pattern to watch. It is simply one awkward interaction. It is a method. Arrange the room, arrange the frame, arrange the people inside that frame, and then watch how the room responds when those people are being arranged. At the Foster Gala, the response happened in real time. One hand extended, no response. And that raises an uncomfortable question about the friendship itself. Because that moment can be interpreted as what happens when a relationship that once looked like friendship begins to feel more like an obligation. So what exactly is the Harry and Meghan marriage serving now? The theory that this is simply about affection has just been tested publicly in front of cameras at an event involving people described as friends, and the footage produced a result. Which leaves us with another possibility, the one that views the marriage not simply as a romantic partnership, but as a structure holding something valuable in place.
So which is it, Meghan? Of course, you know, that's the duality of the Duchess, right? She lives in a kind of parallel existence. The real world and the truth, and then
Project Diana, titles, connections, pedigree, elevation. Look at that list carefully, because every one of those assets belongs to Prince Harry, and not a single one was something he acquired after 2018 through his own independent achievements. The titles came through his grandmother. The connections came through his father. The pedigree came through his bloodline, and the elevation came through a wedding. Viewed from that perspective, the marriage becomes an arrangement built around inherited assets, assets that were inherited by only one side of the partnership. And pressure on an arrangement like that rarely remains theoretical for very long. In this case, there is already a court date attached to it.
the big thing that I've learned with the Sussexes is that whatever the message is that they're sending out, the truth is always the opposite. So if they say we're happy, we're miserable. If they say we're miserable, they're happy. And it's just like a hall of mirrors because they live in their own world, in their own bubble, and Meghan has her truth, which is at odds with reality.
A fool's errand, a judgment that had already been lost, an appeal that many people following the litigation closely had effectively written off. And then there was the cost bill, arriving according to a schedule that didn't care in the slightest what the Instagram gallery looked like. That is the piece that has been left out of the larger picture. The court judgment and that carefully presented summer photo gallery appeared within the same general period. In other words, the image of a blissful family holiday was being released onto a calendar that already contained a lost case and a financial bill that could not simply be moved out of the way in Montecito. That changes the way the photographs can be viewed. They were not simply a celebration of the summer. They were released in spite of what was happening around them. And the reputation being presented in those photographs was supposed to function as the collateral supporting the entire picture.
So Harry and Meghan were at this event because they've got nothing else to do. They've got no jobs or anything. There's no money coming in, sadly. I say that with no pleasure at all. They are in big financial trouble. And that's one of the reasons why the marriage is crumbling.
Irretrievably, not damaged, not dented, beyond retrieval. And that description was volunteered by a commentator explaining why she had no fear of being sued by him, which in itself becomes a kind of verdict. So add everything up. Titles that cannot simply be monetized, a foundation now controlled by somebody else, a court bill that nobody can stop, a lifestyle brand tied to one particular country. And underneath all of it, a marriage that seems unable to photograph convincingly no matter how many cameras are placed in the room. Now watch what Prince Harry begins doing in response. This is where coverage of this couple repeatedly breaks down. And the problem isn't necessarily a lack of reporting. It's a failure to file the pieces together. Stories about the marriage are placed in one folder. Stories about Prince Harry's ambitions in Britain are placed in another. Different presenters, different segments, different weeks. And almost nobody puts those two folders on the same desk, but put them side by side, and the picture begins to look very different because these are not two separate stories. They may actually be the same story being told from opposite ends. We already know there have been reports suggesting that Harry and Meghan are effectively living separate lives. It was also reported that they intended to separate their professional lives, And now it appears that arrangement may have spilled over into their personal lives as well. Separate professionally, bleeding into the personal. That was the arrangement presented to the public, and it was framed as a sign of strength. 2 brands, 2 calendars, 2 independent operations, 1 household. But a household is often the very thing that stops being shared first.
So the Duke and Duchess of Sussex attended the event to show support for long-standing friends David Foster and Catherine McPhee. A little bit embarrassing, therefore, that Meghan was completely blanked by David Foster when she reached out her hand at the photo.
One of them wants Britain. The other has built an entire American lifestyle business around California, the jam, the wine, the branding, the California sunshine that appears in virtually every frame. It is a product deeply tied to that environment, and it could not simply be transported somewhere else and remain the same thing. Move that operation to Windsor and it changes completely. In fact, it may cease to be a viable product at all. And that brings us to the third search question. Why does Prince Harry keep returning to Britain without his wife? Because only one of them appears to have something waiting for them there. This is bigger than an argument over where to spend Christmas. It is a disagreement over a country. And beneath that is an even more consequential question. Which direction do the next 20 years of their lives actually belong to? You can start to see how the relationship itself may be divided by increasingly different priorities. They are no longer necessarily moving toward the same future, and even the question of where their children should be raised has become part of the debate. The story has changed substantially, and that tells me they may be traveling down completely different paths. But there is one line that should have been at the center of virtually every report about this story because it identifies the condition attached to Prince Harry's possible return. It is the condition nobody in Montecito can simply negotiate away. There have been numerous reports suggesting that Harry would like to return to some form of working role within the royal family, and that such a possibility might exist, but not with Meghan. So what would that mean for Harry? And what would it mean for Meghan? 4 words explain the entire situation. The route back exists, but the route back has a passenger limit. And the person who apparently does not fit through that route is the same person Prince Harry brought with him when he walked away. Think about what that could do to a marriage. Every reconciliation dinner, every olive branch, every carefully briefed meeting involving King Charles. For Harry, each one could represent another step toward rebuilding his relationship with the institution he left. But for his wife, the same developments could simultaneously represent another step away from her relevance within that institution. The better the restoration goes for him, the more complicated it becomes for her. That is why there may be no version of reconciliation that represents equally good news for both sides. The marriage has already been placed under pressure by disagreements over finances, by questions about life purpose, and by decisions involving their children. If one spouse wants to move in one direction and the other wants something entirely different, those disagreements stop being minor: finances, purpose, children, country. 4 load-bearing walls. And commentators discussing this relationship increasingly describe all 4 as being under strain. That is why Harry's July trip to Britain looked the way it did. And that, in many ways, became the story. He arrived and carried out various engagements. Then suddenly Meghan was coming. Then she wasn't. Then the children were supposedly coming, then they weren't, and the back and forth continued. It became a circus. Coming, not coming. The children, then no children. But that does not look like a normal security decision. Security decisions are generally made once, privately, by people whose job is to make those decisions. And it doesn't look like an ordinary diary clash either. It looks more like a negotiation being conducted publicly and in real time through competing briefings, while 2 people apparently could not agree on whether the wife was getting on the plane, and the answer kept changing while journalists were watching. Married couples generally don't need to brief the press about each other's travel plans. They discuss those things privately, usually in the kitchen. And then there was the increasingly difficult back and forth with Buckingham Palace. It did not play out particularly well for Harry. To some observers, he appeared petulant. There was criticism that he didn't want to stay and that he appeared ungrateful toward his father. And now Harry and Meghan have, in the eyes of some commentators, become something closer to a public spectacle, a show circus. That was the description attached to a trip that was supposed to represent a reset. There was the funding push. There was the Invictus appearance. There was the possibility of reconciliation. But instead of producing a clean reset, the trip generated roughly 2 weeks of coverage focused on accommodation, competing briefings, and the endless question of who was and was not traveling. The supposed reset did not repair the reputation. Instead, it created another story about the very divisions the reset was supposed to resolve. The reset did not repair the situation. It documented its collapse. And that brings us to the final question, the one filling comment sections this week. There is another story circulating alongside everything we have just examined. You've probably seen the thumbnails. A mystery woman, another relationship, an alleged affair. But here's the part worth knowing about that story, and it does not come from someone defending the Sussexes. It comes from the very same program that has spent this entire discussion methodically examining the problems surrounding the marriage. There are some outrageous rumors circulating about Harry and his relationships with other people. Those are lies. They are lies. Harry is loyal romantically, okay? He may be miserable in the marriage, but he is not cheating. Those were not hesitant comments. They were stated directly twice by a critic discussing the one allegation that could have generated more attention and more views than almost anything else available this month. And that is exactly why the statement matters. The case being made against this marriage does not require an affair. It never did. In fact, the affair allegation may be the weakest part of the entire story because it is the one element that cannot be demonstrated through the footage. Everything else can be placed in front of a camera, and some of what can be seen on camera is considerably more revealing. Someone can be miserable inside a marriage without having another relationship. Both things can be true at the same time. And the second fact does absolutely nothing to disprove the first. A person does not need someone else in order to become emotionally finished with a relationship. So let's go back to where we started. Let's go back to the photographs. That carefully released photo gallery presenting an image of happiness. Remember the old observation that a perfectly happy person would have little reason to constantly announce their happiness. Meghan's public presentation has often appeared to move in the opposite direction. Look how happy we are. Then came MasterChef Australia. She's discussing food, the recipes she enjoys, and the lifestyle story surrounding the brand. And then, bang, Harry appears on the iPad. That moment communicates something. We need to show the world that we're happy. Harry appears on the screen. Now sit with the staging of that moment. A husband appearing digitally during his wife's broadcast, in the middle of a cooking competition on the other side of the world. At precisely the moment a lifestyle segment benefits from visual evidence that the marriage still exists. He wasn't standing beside her at the gala. He wasn't beside her during the photo call when that hand was extended. Instead, he appeared on a device inside her television appearance as a message. And notice the direction in which that traffic moves. He enters her broadcast. He appears inside her booking. He becomes part of her segment. That makes the image feel less like an ordinary husband simply supporting his wife and more like an asset being deployed when the segment needs it. So here is the answer to the first question, the one people keep typing into search engines. Are Harry and Meghan still together? On paper, yes. But when you look at the record of this summer, their appearances, their photographs, their travel, and that same night photo call, the picture becomes much more complicated. The public record suggests something very different from the image of a couple consistently moving through life side by side. A signal is being transmitted to viewers. Meanwhile, the man himself is willing to spend 2.5 hours driving in the opposite direction. And at a friend's own celebration, his wife extends her hand and nobody takes it. The argument being made here is not simply that Harry and Meghan have problems. It is that the foundation of this marriage appears, from the evidence presented, to be under serious strain. The relationship was built around a dream of a fairy tale romance, and critics have long argued that the reality behind that image was very different. There have been accusations of deception and dishonesty from the very beginning. But regardless of how anyone interprets those allegations, one thing remains true. No photograph can manufacture genuine intimacy simply because it has been carefully staged. No lighting can create it. No caption can create it. No perfectly timed release can create it. And no carefully selected image can manufacture the very thing it was supposedly published to prove. That is the entire summer in one sentence. A gallery was released to demonstrate a marriage. A gala tested that image. A hand was extended at a friend's own celebration. Everybody saw what happened. Nobody took it. So here's the question for the comments. And answer it with a year, not a paragraph. What is the last year you remember Harry and Meghan looking genuinely relaxed together in the same photograph? Not posed. Not posed, not captioned, not strategically released, just genuinely relaxed. Put the year in the comments and see how far back this audience actually has to go.